Some peace treaties end wars. Others sound like the plot of a comedy film, from nations agreeing to stop fighting in exchange for a truckload of beer, to enemies signing a treaty because a cat walked into the meeting room. History is full of bizarre deals that somehow worked. These aren't just quirky stories. They shaped borders, ended conflicts, and sometimes made the world safer, all in the weirdest ways imaginable. Which strange peace deal do you think is the funniest or smartest? Let's see if we agree in the comments. In 1618, the 30 Years' War erupted in Europe, a brutal, tangled mess of religion, politics, and territorial greed. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in history, claiming millions of lives. But tucked away in this blood-soaked era is a smaller, stranger conflict that ended not with armies marching, but with barrels rolling. The story takes place in the German region of Westphalia, in a small town whose leaders had been bickering with a neighboring village over, of all things, a bridge toll. This wasn't a symbolic dispute. The bridge was a vital trade link, and both sides wanted the right to collect fees from merchants crossing it. The argument escalated. First came the shouting matches between traders. Then came the rock throwing. By the following spring, it had spiraled into a localized war, more like repeated skirmishes between armed militias and full-scale battles, but deadly nonetheless. For months, they raided each other's storehouses and even burned crops. The toll bridge, ironically, was destroyed early in the fighting, meaning both towns lost the very thing they were fighting over. By winter, both sides were exhausted. Supplies were dwindling, morale was gone, and the larger 30 Years' War was still raging in the background, threatening to sweep them into a much deadlier conflict. That's when the mayor of one town, a man named Hans Muller, came up with a strange proposal. He invited the leaders of the opposing town to a meeting in a neutral barn halfway between their borders. But instead of bringing soldiers or maps, Muller brought beer. Lots of it. The beer was brewed in his town, famous for its rich, malty flavor. He rolled in barrels, cracked them open, and poured mugs for everyone present, including his supposed enemies. At first, there was suspicion. Was the beer poisoned? Was this a trap? But the cold winter air and the smell of fresh hops soon softened the mood. Someone made a joke, someone else laughed, and slowly the tension thawed. After hours of drinking, talking, and realizing they were all just tired farmers and merchants rather than bloodthirsty warriors, they began drafting a treaty. The final agreement was short and almost absurd. The bridge would be rebuilt jointly. Tolls would be split evenly. Each year, both towns would exchange barrels of their best beer as a gesture of goodwill. This bizarre beer treaty not only ended their feud, but also became a celebrated local tradition. For decades afterward, the annual beer exchange was a festival where the two towns drank together instead of fighting. The rest of the 30 Years' War raged on, but in this little corner of Westphalia, peace flowed, quite literally, from a tap. The strangest part? Historians believe that without Muller's beer diplomacy, the feud might have dragged on long enough for imperial armies to intervene, which would have meant destruction for both towns. It's a reminder that sometimes a good drink and a good laugh can achieve what swords never will. In 1558, two tiny Italian city-states, Montorio and Castelverde, had been locked in a petty but bitter feud for over a decade. The cause? A strip of land barely a kilometer wide, but rich in olive trees and vineyards. To outsiders, it seemed laughable that such a small patch of soil could inspire years of hostility. But in Renaissance Italy, where prestige was as important as profit, losing territory was a matter of pride. The fighting wasn't constant. It came in bursts of sabotage, ambushes, and night raids. Montorio would burn Castelverde's vineyards. Castelverde would poison Montorio's wells. Both sides had tried peace talks several times, But every attempt ended with one side storming out. By the spring of 1558, both populations were weary. The Pope, tired of hearing reports of Christian towns brawling like mercenaries, sent a mediator, Cardinal Vincenzo della Rovere, a man with a reputation for charm, wit, and stubborn persistence. The cardinal invited both city councils to meet. In Castelverdi's grand hall, a stone-walled chamber lit by dozens of flickering candles. The tension was palpable. Delegates from each city glared across the long table, their hands resting near the hilts of ceremonial daggers. As the cardinal began to speak, there was a sudden disturbance. From a shadowy corner of the hall, a large gray cat padded into this room. It strolled lazily down the aisle, tail high, and, as if aware of the drama unfolding, leapt up onto the long table. At first, people chuckled. But the cat didn't leave. It walked directly to the pile of parchment on which the cardinal's scribe had prepared the treaty draft. Then, in a move that seemed almost scripted, the cat stepped squarely onto the paper, leaving a perfect inky paw print where the signatures were meant to go. The room fell silent, and then erupted in laughter. For the first time in years, the men from Montorio and Castelverde were laughing together. The cardinal, quick to seize the moment, declared, "Gentlemen, it seems God has sent us a witness who fears neither your swords nor your tempers." The delegates, still chuckling, agreed to finalize the treaty. The paw print was left untouched at the bottom of the document, alongside the official seals of both cities. From that day forward, it was known as El Trattato della Zampa, the Paw Treaty. The agreement itself was simple. The disputed land would be shared equally, with its olives and grapes split by season. But the true magic was in the shift of tone. The cat's unexpected signature broke the cycle of distrust and gave both sides a shared story they could retell with pride instead of resentment. In the years that followed, both towns held a small festival each spring in honor of the treaty. A chosen diplomatic cat, usually the laziest, friendliest feline in the village, was paraded through the streets wearing a tiny velvet cape. It's hard to say whether the treaty would have been signed without that cat's interruption. But in a time when grudges were often paid in blood, a well-placed paw print was enough to change history. In 1803, deep in the Caucasus Mountains, two small kingdoms, Kartveli and Ardania, found themselves at war over, quite literally, a goat. The animal, belonging to a wealthy merchant in Kartveli, had wandered across the border into Ardania. When the merchant demanded it back, Ardania refused, claiming the goat had been liberated from an abusive owner. The situation, absurd as it was, became a matter of national pride. Within weeks, militias were mobilized, and what began as a dispute over livestock escalated into real fighting. The Goat War, as historians later called it, dragged on for months. Skirmishes flared in the mountain passes, caravans were ambushed, and both economies suffered. Eventually, winter brought a halt to most fighting. Supplies were running low, and the harsh snow made troop movements almost impossible. That's when the rulers, King Dado of Kartveli and Prince Aslan of Ardania, agreed to meet for peace talks in a remote hunting lodge. Both men were stubborn, proud, and convinced they could out-negotiate the other. The lodge was dimly lit, with a roaring fire casting long shadows over the table where the treaty papers sat untouched. For hours, they argued over terms. Who would get the goat? Who would pay reparations? Who would officially win? No progress was made. Then, during a break, King Dado noticed a beautifully carved chessboard on a side table. He challenged Prince Aslan to a game, half in jest, saying, "If we can't agree on paper, perhaps we can agree on the board." Aslan, a skilled player himself, accepted. What began as a casual distraction quickly turned into a battle of wits. The soldiers and advisors, who had been on edge all day, gathered around to watch in silence. The game was intense. Dato opened, aggressively, pushing his pawns forward. Aslan countered with precise, calculated moves. An hour passed, then another. Neither man was willing to resign. Finally, after a clever series of sacrifices, Aslan found himself in checkmate. Instead of gloating, he leaned back and smiled. "You win the game," he said, "and I suppose the goat as well." Dato laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time in months. Something shifted in that moment. The tension broke. Over the next hour, they drafted a treaty that reflected compromise rather than conquest. The goat would be returned. No. Reparations would be paid, and both sides would declare the war officially ended with no winner dot to commemorate the unusual end to the conflict. They had a new chessboard carved, with the treaty's date and a small engraving of a goat on its border. For years, both kingdoms held annual chess tournaments in honor of the peace agreement, while the Goat War was barely a footnote in the grand sweep of history. It became a beloved legend in the Caucasus, a story of how two leaders unable to find common ground in politics found it instead in the 64 squares of a game board dot. It's a reminder that sometimes the best way to win a war is not to play it at all. In the late summer of 1921, the nations of Norhaven and Belmer found themselves on the brink of war. Both were small maritime powers in the North Atlantic, each dependent on fishing rights in the same rich patch of ocean known as the Silver Banks. The problem started when a Belmarian trawler was accused of crossing into Norhaven's waters and taking an enormous haul of cod. Norhaven responded by sending armed patrol boats into the disputed area. Belmer did the same. Within weeks, tensions had escalated into full-blown naval standoffs. The newspapers fanned the flames, calling it the Cod Clash and warning of an inevitable war. Both governments felt pressured to defend their honor, and negotiations on land stalled completely. That's when an eccentric shipping magnate named Elias Rourke made an unusual offer. Rourke, who owned a fleet of luxury steam yachts and had friends in both countries, suggested that peace talks be held at sea. Literally in the disputed waters dot, it sounded ridiculous. But the idea had a strange appeal. Neutral ground, away from prying journalists and political posturing. And so, in September, two gleaming yachts anchored side by side in the middle of the Silver Banks. On one was Norhaven's delegation, led by Admiral Henrik Voss. On the other, Belmer's delegation, led by Minister Lyle Caro. The meeting began stiffly. The delegations shouted across a narrow gangplank connecting the two decks, accusing each other of aggression. But then, something happened that no one expected. A massive pod of humpback whales surfaced nearby, breaching and slapping their tails. The sound and sight were so breathtaking that both delegations fell silent, leaning over the rails to watch. The sea itself seemed to be putting on a show, as if reminding them that the ocean was vast enough to share. Elias Rourke, sensing the moment, had a long table brought onto the gangplank and draped in white cloth. "If you can't agree on land," he said, "let the sea be your witness." The two leaders sat down, with the gentle sway of the ocean beneath them, and began to talk, not shout, about quotas, seasons, and shared enforcement. The whales lingered nearby for hours, diving and resurfacing as if guarding the proceedings. By sunset, a treaty had been signed. It declared the Silver Banks a joint fishing zone, with each nation granted equal quotas and a rotating patrol schedule to prevent poaching. The document was sealed in a watertight brass tube and ceremonially lowered into the ocean as a symbolic second copy, entrusted to the sea itself. The Gangplank Treaty, as it became known, held for decades, fostering a rare maritime cooperation between the two countries. Every few years, representatives would return to the Silver Banks to renew the agreement. Always at sea, and always in sight of whales. It's a reminder that sometimes you don't need a grand hall or a capital city to make history. Sometimes all you need is a table, a horizon, and a reason to share the water. In 1947, the towns of St. Bellamy and Eastford, nestled along the border between two post-war European nations, were a single bridge apart and a lifetime of grudges away from peace. The two had once been a united community, but the shifting borders after World War II split them in two. Overnight, neighbors became foreigners, families were divided, and old rivalries hardened into hostility. The most visible wound was the Bridge of Silence, where armed guards glared at each other daily, and no one crossed except on official orders. Tensions boiled over one autumn when both towns planned harvest festivals on the same weekend. St. Bellamy accused Eastford of trying to steal their traditional date. Eastford accused St. Bellamy of threatening their musicians. The situation spiraled when both mayors ordered their town bands to set up facing each other across the river, playing at full volume in a petty battle of the brass. It was loud, ridiculous, and on the verge of turning violent when an unexpected figure stepped in, not a diplomat, not a soldier, but an 82-year-old cafe owner named Marguerite Lemar. Marguerite had lived in St. Bellamy all her life, and her cafe sat just a block from the bridge. Known for her sharp tongue and legendary stews, she had no patience for grown men acting like children. That Sunday, she dragged a long wooden table from her cafe, carried it right onto the bridge, and began setting out bowls of soup. At first, soldiers on both sides shouted for her to move. She ignored them. Then curious townsfolk began drifting toward the smell of garlic and rosemary. Before long, people from both sides were sitting together at the table, sharing bread and soup, their music still blaring, but now accompanied by laughter. Marguerite, never one to waste an opportunity, produced a red and white checkered tablecloth and laid it across the table. She pulled a fountain pen from her apron and said, "If you're going to act like neighbors, then sign something that says so." The mayors, embarrassed but unwilling to defy the grandmotherly force of nature before them, took turns writing their names on the fabric. Soon others followed, band leaders, shopkeepers, even a few soldiers. The hastily written Bridge of Soup agreement was simple. The harvest festival would be shared, alternating locations each year, and the bridge would be open to civilians. For the duration of the celebrations, the tablecloth, covered in signatures and the occasional soup stain, was framed and hung in Marguerite's cafe, where it remains to this day. Every autumn, during the festival, the town set up a massive table across the bridge and share a meal. No guards, no shouting, just the hum of conversation and the clink of spoons. It wasn't the kind of treaty that made history books or changed the fate of nations. But for two small towns, it was a peace as real as any written on parchment, and far tastier. Sometimes peace isn't forged in grand palaces or under glittering chandeliers. It's born over a chessboard, on the deck of a ship, or across a tablecloth stained with soup. These stories prove that human connection can be stranger and stronger than conflict. Which treaty was your favorite? Drop it in the comments, and let's see which unusual path to peace our community crowns as the best.